Ananda has very generously agreed to do a conversation now with Julie Francois Tolliver, who is the professor teaching the Neustadt class about her work. Would you please welcome to the stage Julie Francois Tolliver?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to say a few thank yous before I start. First, I'd like to thank the Neustadt family very much for making all of this possible. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at World Literature Today, RC, Daniel, Terry, Kay, Parker, Rob. All of them have worked so hard to make this happen. Thank you. I'd like to thank Fabienne Canard, the author who was the jury member who championed Ananda's laureateship last year. I'm so grateful to her for having nominated you and bringing your work to us and to so many others. And finally, I really want to thank you first for this beautiful keynote address and for all of your writing, which has brought us so much joy, so much intellectual exploration with my class this semester. It has been just the most wonderful experience. So thank you very much. I know it said that I was going to have a conversation with Ananda, but these questions that we're going to ask today and for the conversation originated from a conversation that my students and I have been having all semester. If you could raise your hand, my students, all of you, thank you. Yes, they are a wonderful group, they're brilliant. And so I decided that I would let them ask their questions, and I will ask a few questions as well, if that's okay.
Yes, sure.
Okay. Pleasure. Mitch, do you want to get started?
Honey, we read in an interview that you started writing at the age of 7 or 8, which is incredibly young. So I was curious if that was like a moment. Was there an event that inspired you, a text that inspired you, or was it like an organic, gradual thing?
Thank you. That's a lovely question because it will allow me to pay homage to my parents because we were living in a very small village in Mauritius called Trois Boutiques, 3 shops, because originally it had 3 shops and then it only had 2. And nothing had sort of predisposed me to writing, save for the fact that my parents were both avid readers. And just to have a short anecdote, which I tend to share with people about my family. My father especially loved reading. And when he got married, they used to get married very young at that time, and my mother was only 16. And she was very she didn't have a very good health, and she had been very little to school. So she wouldn't dare open a book herself. So in the evening, my father would read aloud to her. And he loved the sort of Agatha Christie novels and all these, kind of whodunit. And he would always teasingly stop at a point where, you wanted to know what would happen next. And she would beg him to continue. He said, no, I'm sleepy, so, we'll continue tomorrow. And then one day she felt so compelled to know what was going to happen next. She opened the book and found out that she could read by herself. She didn't need him to read aloud. And she read the whole book. So when he came home, she said, well, I know who did it. and she didn't stop. She never stopped reading after that. So when my father used to go to the city, to the capital city, once a week, he would go to a second-hand bookshop and buy, sort of piles of books, very eclectic, of different in English, French, sometimes also Sanskrit books, something like that, and bring them in a box. And my sisters and I used to wait for that box, with so much anticipation. And they allowed us to read everything, which I think was a very good way to make us sort of open up our minds. So for me, this reading from the age of 4 onwards was like sort of the most important thing in my life. And so it was more an organic, natural way of growing into it. And I didn't realize there was something special about it until I was about 12 or 13. And suddenly I realized that not all my friends wrote as much as I did, and that the teachers started to sort of notice that I could write. And maybe I knew from the age of 13 onwards that I wanted to be a writer.
Thank you.
Hello. You've lived in many places so far, Mauritius, the UK, Congo, Brazzaville, and France, and perhaps elsewhere. And how did living in these places shape who you are? And also, what has made you choose to settle in France? And do you have plans to move elsewhere in the future?
Sorry, at the end I didn't hear.
And do you have plans to move elsewhere in the future?
Yeah, I've moved quite a bit. Not out of choice necessarily, but just the circumstances of life meant that I had to go abroad for my studies, because at the time the University of Mauritius was a fledgling university, so it didn't really sort of give all the options that you wanted. So I went to London to study social anthropology. Then, while I was doing my research for my PhD, I got engaged to this gentleman sitting in front, and we got married in Mauritius, because I was doing my research in Mauritius, and I got pregnant immediately and went back to London to write my thesis and have my baby at the same time. So it was 9 months, which were very sort of, how should I say, at the same time fulfilling, but very, very scary to be there. I was on my own because he was working in Brazzaville. Then, because he was working for the World Health Organization, he was posted in Brazzaville, so we went there. And then he was transferred to Geneva, Switzerland, to the headquarters. So we went there with the 2 children. And the reason why we settled in France is on the border between Switzerland and Geneva and France, because our children were already in a sort of public school system, like l'école publique, French école publique in Congo, and we wanted to keep them in that system. So we settled in Ferney-Voltaire, and thinking it would be for a few years, but we have been there ever since. However, from the point of view of writing, I think that I was very much shaped by the fact that I started writing in Mauritius. And I can say that from my first collection of short stories, which I wrote entirely when I was there, all the sort of themes that come up in my books were already there in a kind of nascent type of, latent type of place. And so I think that living in different places really enlarged my mind, certainly, and gave me other types of experiences. But as a writer, I think everything was sort of already there from Mauritius, which is why I sort of am rooted there. Even when some of my books are not set there, somewhere it's still present in those books. So I think, I've taken it with me, taken Mauritius with me, and or that image of it, or that sort of very strong, powerful source of inspiration with me wherever I have been. And As for whether I'll be going somewhere else, I don't know. We'll see where life takes me next.
We read your story, The Sad Ambassador, and we spent a lot of time thinking about what the role of an ambassador means. And this story is also about a writer who ends up narrating the ambassador's story. How do you see your role as a writer in relation to that of an ambassador? Do you represent countries or cultures, and do you see yourself mediating or sending messages to people from other cultures?
Which story did you
The
read?
Sad Ambassador.
The Sad Ambassador. So the first one, the first story. Yeah. Well, actually, this collection of short stories came about because I'm invited to different places as a writer, to different festivals and different countries, obviously. So some of the experiences I had during those travels were sort of made me want to write a short story about it. And for example, The Sad Ambassador, I was at the Jaipur Book Festival in India. And I actually saw this ambassador, really coming to the festival and sort of attending every single event, every talk and coming to the lunch. And I sort of said, well, to somebody, who is that gentleman? They said he's the ambassador of Iceland, I started thinking, well, what does the ambassador of Iceland have to do in India? What's his job? So this is how it came about. But then I kept that the presence of the writer also inside the story, because it was at the same time fairly humoristic, but it also shows how real life sort of can inspire a story that goes in a different direction, obviously. So these stories, I had fun writing them because for once they were not too dark, and for the other, I managed to sort of pick from some of my own experiences to write them.
Thank you.
We also were wondering about your trajectory across different fields. So you're a doctor in anthropology, a writer. You mentioned also your knowledge of music. I was wondering if you could tell us what relationships you see between, for example, the field of anthropology and then fiction or poetry, and whether there are other fields that you consider yourself influenced by or influencing.
Yeah, when I was going to go for my further studies, most of my teachers were telling me, well, you should go obviously to study literature or languages because you seem to be, to have a penchant for this. And maybe out of a spirit of a contradictory spirit or contrarian spirit, but also mostly because I loved writing and reading so much. I wanted it to be something that was very personal to me. So I didn't want to go and sort of try to pull a book apart to understand. Sorry, I'm not discouraging you from doing that. It was just very personal to me that I felt that the spontaneity of discovering a book, of loving it in a kind of very organic way, would be lost if you're actually studying how it, dissecting a book. And the other reason I didn't want to study literature was that by studying closely the masterpieces that have been written by writers from time immemorial, it might make me feel I'll never be able to do that and not have the courage to go on writing. Because at that time I had just published one collection of short stories. I had no idea, whether I would be able to find a publisher for my next book. So for this reason, I thought, no, I'm not going to go and study literature. And I was very interested in anthropology, which was a field, that was not known in Mauritius at all, but I had read books by Margaret Mead and, her explorations and discoveries. And I liked the fact that anthropologists had to live within the society they were studying to be able to write about it, and not just, from an external point of view and, sort of try to describe something that they might not necessarily know very deeply. And I was fascinated by the fact that they had to take a step out and go to these places and try to, rid themselves of their own preconceptions, maybe sometimes their own culture, their own ways of thinking, to be able to understand the other. And when I went to SOAS, to the School of Oriental and African Studies, it was wonderful because every single professor, lecturer, or teacher spoke another language, either one of the African languages or an Asian language. And they had this very open mindset at a time in the 70s when there was still a lot of racism in the UK. And so I really felt, sort of that I belonged to that university. But afterwards, as Arsi said, I sort of swerved back towards writing, but this anthropological way of looking at society and at the mechanisms whereby people live together or identify or divide, still sort of feeds into my writing, I think, that somewhere in the poetry or in the very personal type of prose I write, there is the anthropological eye looking at society and sort of, analyzing it somewhere in there. But I have also worked many years as a translator, and there also my love of languages has sort of come to the forefront, and I think it's absolutely fascinating to translate, and literary translation is something that is a wonderful and very, very difficult enterprise, and I'm so happy when I sort of read a book that's very well translated to the point that you don't realize it's a translation. And with Jeffrey Zuckerman, who translated Eve out of her ruins, he just wrote to me, emailed me one day, saying, I read Eve de Sédécombre, I love that book. Has it been optioned for an English translation? So I said, not to my knowledge, no. And then he sent me a passage, a few pages, and I loved his way of looking at it. And we've worked together again for the living days. And I don't even feel the need to sort of compare the French and the English. When I read his version, first of all, I feel as if it's my own voice. I don't feel as if it's... But wherever there's one point where I feel, okay, this is not exactly what I wanted to say, then I'll go back and look at it and we'll discuss it. But mostly I trust him implicitly.
That's wonderful. We actually had a question about translation, but you answered it. Thank you.
So my classmates and I are very interested in your essay about American poet Sylvia Plath, and we're very excited to see it translated into English. And we have a few questions about it. If you could speak about why you chose Sylvia Plath and her impact on your writing, as well as how you blend autobiography with Sylvia Plath's life and her works.
Thank you. This is a book that, again, maybe I could compare it to The Green Sari, which I took so long to write. The book about Sylvia Plath I wanted to write or I was writing for many years, always coming back to it and always thinking I'm not doing what I want to do and it's not right and I don't know I'm going to go into it. But I discovered her again when I went for my studies in London. And I remember very well, when you're arriving from a tropical island to a place like London in the 70s, which is not at all what it's like today. So it was very dreary, it was raining, it was an autumn day, and, the first thing you wanted to say, okay, I want to take the next plane back home, I don't want to stay here. And then I remember I went to the university residence was in Russell Square, which is the sort of Bloomsbury area where Virginia Woolf and so many of these writers of the time were living. So in a way, I sort of felt maybe there's something here that I can sort of try to attach myself to. And then I went to a big bookshop and looking for Virginia Woolf, because I had some books, not everything. And just nearby, there was a book of poems by Sylvia Plath. And I took it and started reading. I didn't know her at the time. And I immediately sort of fell into those aerial poems. So then they've been sort of constant presences in my life. But also when I read about her life and read her diaries and her letters and everything, I realized how fascinated I was by the relationship of the two poets, her and her husband, Ted Hughes, trying to, at the same time, passionately in love with each other, thinking that they're going to be sort of a kind of stellar couple, shining throughout the world of poets. And slowly she realizes that he's the one sort of flying, and she's the one who's sort of considered, a minor feminine poet, in poetry of intimacy, which was sort of really not very, considered high poetry. So slowly the equilibrium between the two changes and falters, and then you see the woman feeling betrayed by the man, and the poet feeling that she wants to shine too, and she's being prevented in a way by being in this relationship with him and constantly compared to him. He's also sometimes very critical of her writing. So I felt that, even I was in what I said earlier about the writer and the woman, being in a kind of strange relationship, or even not in a relationship, completely separate. I also felt for a long time that as a woman, I was completely different to the writer. The writer was completely fearless from an early age about what I was writing about, not afraid of family or society or anything like that. I wrote what I wanted to write the way I wanted it. And then as a woman, I was extremely shy, I found it difficult to sort of express myself or even to assert myself, sometimes on a daily basis. So I felt I could understand her in a very deep way, her anxiety, her, feeling of dissatisfaction with herself. But when you read her diaries, she only had 2 books published before, well, 1 book published before her death, one collection of of poems and 1 novel, and then that's it. But her diaries are thousands of pages, and when you read them, you see everything she could have written afterwards was already there in that. She was thinking of novels, creating characters, wonderful descriptions. And I keep thinking if she had lived, everything was there. She would have just had to let this creativity flow out. But she couldn't, face it alone with her 2 kids, and it was a very difficult time, obviously. So finally, I managed to sort of create something that's very hybrid. It's not a biography. It tells us some part of the story of her life, but at the same time, that I kind of dream her what she's saying and what she's thinking, try to sort of create a kind of parallel type of Sylvia, who's my Sylvia, if you like. So the book is a hybrid thing, you know, which is why perhaps I was finding it difficult to write, because I had to let myself be free to write it the way I wanted to before I could actually finish it. So I hope you'll read it one day.
So you're fluent in 3 languages at least. You write across them. I'm thinking of So Delarge, your poetry compilation, which is in French, English, and Mauritian Creole.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting text. So it makes me curious about the ways that you find language having sort of an impact on the things that you write. When you write in French, for instance, do you find it changing the way you write or the things you write about? Do you think there are things that English or Mauritian Creole are better at telling, or kinds of poetry, stylistically?
Well, let's say first and foremost that my writing language is French. You know, there's no two ways about that. It's really the language from which, the first impulse, or comes. When I have an idea, I will be writing it in French. But I also write a lot with the ear. You were talking about music, so there is a music in the language which I love using, the sonorities, the cadences, the flow of a sentence. And definitely I find if I'm writing in English, this changes, because obviously the sonorities are different, the flow is different. So it's a kind of moving from between waves, it's like sort of, or currents, let's say, and swimming with a different current. And I remember when I had finished one of my novels called Pugly, it was published in 2001, and I was invited to go to India, and they wanted to publish a book in English before I went. And I suggested I could rewrite Pugly in English myself, so they said, yes, fine, if you want. And I immediately realized that it wasn't a translation, but because it was my own book, I felt freer, freer than a different translator would have felt. And I found that some places were too lyrical, that in French it flowed very well. In English it became, sort of almost over-sentimental. And I found myself shortening the sentences and really sort of adapting it so that it felt natural in English. And also sometimes the images would be different because of the sonority of the words. It's really a fascinating process, moving from one language to another. But even when I write in French, these different languages come in also sometimes. The different sentence structures. In one of my books entitled La vie de Joséphin le Fou, it's written in a kind of broken, you think it's a broken French, but it's a French which integrates the Creole grammar or syntax. So a lot of the articles are omitted, so then you realize that it's almost Creole that you're reading. For Ceux du Large, I wrote the series of poems in French, and it was about migration, crossing the ocean. I was thinking of my own, sort of family's history. And then I was invited to the US for Eve in 2016 when there was the electoral campaign between Trump and Hillary Clinton. And I heard Donald Trump's messages of hate towards migrants. Sorry if I'm offending anybody, but I thought that he freed people to express a lot of violence and hate openly towards migrants, especially. So I thought, well, since I'm speaking to the public, I might read some of those poems. So I started in my hotel room rewriting them in English. And finally, I thought, well, I also have Mauritian Creole, and I write in Mauritian Creole. But while I was doing the rewrites, I had ideas to sort of change the French also. So finally, it became a kind of exchange between the three languages. But I don't know if we have time or we have to finish. But even the titles are very expressive of the of the different ways that those languages very deeply resonate. Because in French, it's a bit sort of a passive thing, ceux du large, you know, they're those who are at sea. You don't know if they're drowning, you don't know if they're floating. And then in English, it becomes afloat, which means that they are floating. So there's a kind of hopefulness. And then in Creole, it becomes bal noyé, which means the drowned. And I think because for the Creole part, the past of slavery comes back to the fore, because this is how the Creole language emerged in the context of slavery. And so many drowned crossing the seas that this became the title without my even thinking about it. You know, it was a kind of sort of immediate inspiration, if you like, for these titles.
We have found your text to be deeply beautiful and sometimes deeply disturbing. I know you touched on this a little bit during your lecture, but could you tell us a little bit more about what it is that inspires you to write about such difficult topics, such as dire poverty, the unequal relations between people, about physical and emotional abuse?
Mm. I'm not sure about why I choose these dark themes. I think perhaps because our history in Mauritius is very, you know, it's a very recent history. It's not more than 400 years old. So, and it's already had these very deep scars of slavery and the transport of indentured laborers from India, which was also a very, very difficult period of history. And I think that it's difficult coming from that kind of society to write perhaps more, to write about other things, because you can see it in front of you, what's happening. And the hope I had, I was saying that my first novel was very pessimistic, but at the same time, I had a lot of hope about Mauritius, about its future, because of the so many different communities or people of different racial, religious, linguistic, geographic origin had come together in this small island. I felt that it could be an extraordinary place where this kind of hybridity breeds something more open to the other, more open to other cultures, because we are fed by different cultures. And then slowly as time passed, I saw that, in fact, it was sort of not moving in that direction, but on the contrary of more sort of closing identities, more rigid identities, and people were using these identities to separate themselves from the others and to create a kind of sort of latent conflict or latent hostility within the society. At the same time, the economic development was very, it was a successful country sort of economically, but then the people were going towards, sort of having materialistic ambitions rather than, more humane, let's say. And so there's a kind of, or a part of the population that's completely left on the side of the road, if you like, in all this race towards, consumerism and accumulating goods and possessions. And so again, maybe it's more a kind of instinct or personal way of looking at the world, is sort of to look at those who are being left aside and trying to go and be with them, but inside them, and have their voices emerge through my books. And in this with Eve, in this particular novel, I was writing it at a time where even in France, in Paris, there were lots of riots in the banlieue where the young felt disenfranchised, and they were, setting fire to cars and breaking down, well, a bit like in the film. And I sort of saw that when you watch these images on television, there was all sorts of discourses going on around them, that sort of the media was talking about them, the psychologists sometimes were asked to sociologists were asked to talk about that, and politicians, obviously, but never themselves, you never heard their voices. So all this came into this particular, novel where I wanted to listen to their voices. And actually, when we went to film there in Mauritius, we found a place that was very close to Troumaron, which actually is an invented place. I didn't actually use a real place, but I think it was very close to what the book was depicting. Although maybe the book is darker in a way because it starts at night, but it's a different creation. But I think it very much, does what the book it does say what the book is saying, and in a very in a way that impacts you more because you're seeing it on the screen.
Maybe we could do one more question, if there is another question. And also, I think it might be a great idea. I was just talking to Amanda Kordelewski about this. If you have a little bit of time before you leave, Green Feather Books is here. If you wanted to buy a book, this would be a great time to do that and have the author sign it, give you a chance to talk to the author as well. So maybe we'll go with one more question. Anybody?
We were
Questions?
actually going to open it up to the audience because I know we have some other experts in the audience who have read her books.
Other questions? Who would like? I'll bring the microphone to you.
There's someone
Right here, RC.
Ah, great.
On your writing path, has there been anything or anyone or maybe even yourself that has kind of held you back?
Has there been anything that held me back when writing?
Anything, anyone, or maybe even yourself?
As I said, I don't think I held myself back when writing, but maybe I didn't go out and look as for publishers in a way that was as what would I say, proactive. I mean, it's not a word I like, but let's say, I see with young writers today, they will go and knock on doors and try to, meet people who could help them get published and all that. But for me, I was just sending my, manuscripts by the post and waiting and getting rejections and feeling really down. So it took me a long time to, maybe it wasn't just the only reason, but it took me a long time to emerge. But at the same time, I'm not sorry because I took this time also to sort of improve the craft of writing. And I feel that the books from, let's say, 2000 onwards are really sort of more books I'm more happy about than those that I wrote before. Probably what did hold me up also is that I was coming from a country which was, sort of not part of the center or literary center, which Paris is, or London, or, So when you're outside, at that time, it was very difficult to be, even for French publishers to be open to other voices coming from elsewhere, And one of the publishers told me, but we think it's not exotic enough. You know, you're not talking enough about. We don't see the island, the tropical island, in what you write. But I wasn't describing the tropical, you know. So there was that kind of difficulty in getting a major publisher in France, and many of my African writers from the African continent, Francophone writers of my generation, had the same problem. They felt that there was a kind of category, you know. In France, when we were called Francophone, it meant we were not French. So it was sort of considered a bit second category of writers. So we fought a lot about, so we wrote different texts about it. And I feel that over the past 10 or 15 years, this has changed radically, that the French publishers now really want to have other voices, want to get all these young, upcoming writers from different places, countries, to be read and to be published. So I think, in a way, my generation sort of opened a bit the way for this acceptance. But that was probably the main difficulty, was getting published, basically.
Thank you so much, Ananda, Devi. This has really been wonderful having you. Another round of applause.